The Ordeal of Mark Twain by Wyck Brooks. Chapter VI. Everybody's Neighbor. Friends are an expensive luxury, and when a man's whole capital is invested in a calling and a mission in life, he cannot afford to keep them. The costliness of keeping friends does not lie in what one does for them, but in what one, out of consideration for them, refrains from doing. This means the crushing of many an intellectual germ. Ibsen, Letter to Brandes, 1870. And now behold the burgeoning, the efflorescence of Mark Twain that all America knew. Forgotten, deeply buried, is the queer, fanciful, uncommunicative child of earlier days. Forgotten is the grave and passionate young poet of the Mississippi, the pilot, even the miner who used to go off by himself and brood among those vague thoughts of his. Forgotten is the young poet, and still unborn is the cynical philosopher of the years to come. Now, and for at least one glowing decade, Mark Twain finds himself, as he says, thoroughly and uniformly and unceasingly happy. He has not faced the conflict in his own soul. He has simply surrendered and repressed his leading instinct, and every great surrender brings with it a sensation of more or less joyous relief. Were it not for the bitterness which that repression is destined to engender, who could regret, indeed, that he has found in quotidian interests and affections and appetites so complete an escape from the labors and the struggles of the creative spirit? Meanwhile, as his individuality sinks back, the race character emerges. He reverts to type, and everything characteristic of his pioneer heritage, his pioneer environment, comes to the surface in him. It is like a sudden flowering in his nature of all the desires of those to whom his own desire has, from the outset of his life, subjected itself. Mr. Herbert Croly, in his Life of Mark Hanna, has described that worthy as the typical pioneer business man. "Personalities and associations," he says, "composed the substance of Mark Hanna's life. His disposition was active, sympathetic, and expansive, and it was both uncritical and uncalculating. He accepted from his surroundings the prevailing ideas and modes of action. He had an instinctive disposition towards an expansive all round life." Such was the character of Boss Hanna, trait by trait. It had now become the prevailing character of Mark Twain. Had he not endeavored to make himself over into another person, a person in whom his family might take pride and pleasure? He had striven to satisfy their standards, to do and feel and think and admire as they did, and felt and thought and admired, and at last the metamorphosis had, to all appearances, taken place. Mark Twain had become primarily the husband, the father, and the business man with responsibilities, the purpose of whose writing was to please his friends, make money, and entertain his own household. That vast unemployed artistic energy of his, however, which had not found its proper channel, overflowed this narrow mold. Mark Twain was like a stream dammed in mid career, and so powerful was that unconscious current which had been checked that instead of turning into a useful mill pond he became a flood. We have seen that his home had always been the hub of Mark Twain's universe. "Upset and disturbed," as he often was, says Paine, "he seldom permitted his distractions to interfere with the program of his fireside." It was there, indeed, that all the latent poetry of his nature, the poetry that so seldom got into his books, found its vent. "To us," he wrote once, "our house was not unsentient matter. It had a heart and a soul, and eyes to see us with, and approvals and solicitudes, and deep sympathies. It was of us, and we were in its confidence, and lived in its grace and in the peace of its benediction. We never came home from an absence that its face did not light up and speak out its eloquent welcome, and we could not enter it unmoved. It is evident from this how much the energy of Mark Twain's imagination had passed neither into his art nor exactly into his love, but rather into the worship of the hearth itself, as the symbol, one might say, of his one great piety. From the very beginning, says Mr. Paine, Mark Twain's home meant always more to him than his work. Indeed, in the name of his domestic ties, he had as completely surrendered his individuality as any monk in the name of religion. Naturally, his home was important to him. It had become the spring of all his motives and all his desires, and having accepted the role of the opulent householder, he threw into it as much energy as two ordinary men are able to throw into their life work. Mark Twain had accepted his father in law's challenge. He was not going to fall behind the pace set by a coal merchant whose household expenses were $40,000 a year. No one ever delighted more than he now in living up to those principles of the conspicuous consumption of goods, predatory emulation, and the pecuniary canons of taste, which, according to Mr. Veblen, actuate the propertied class. A failure to increase one's visible consumption when the means for an increase are at hand is felt in popular apprehension, says Mr. Veblen, to call for explanation, and unworthy motives of miserliness are imputed to those who fall short in this respect. Of course, Mark Twain couldn't stand that. As early as 1875 he writes to Mr. Howells, "You see I take a vile, mercenary view of things, but then my household expenses are something almost ghastly." He estimated that in the year of 1881 he had spent considerably more than $100,000. It was with the increased scale of living, says Mr. Paine, that Clemens had become especially eager for some source of commercial profit, something that would yield a return, not in paltry thousands, but hundreds of thousands. Like Colonel Sellers, he must have something with millions in it. This was the visible sign that his mode of living had now become permanently extravagant. In 1906, long after his wife had died, and when he was living much of the time virtually alone, his household expenses amounted, according to Mr. Paine, to more than $50 a day. In the matter of food, the choicest and most expensive the market could furnish was always served in lavish abundance. He had the best and the highest priced servants, ample as to number. Certainly his natural taste, which was always, we are told, for a simple, inexpensive style, would never have set that scale. It was a habit he had formed in those early efforts to qualify as an admired citizen, and so was his disposition towards an expansive all round life, a disposition that finally made all concentration impossible to him. In his large hospitality and in certain boyish love of grandeur, says Mr. Paine, he gloried in the splendor of his entertainment, the admiration and delight of his guests. There were always guests. They were coming and going constantly. Clemens used to say that he proposed to establish a 'bus line between their house and the station for the accommodation of his company. For the better portion of the year he was willing to pay the price of it, whether in money or in endurance. After a while he virtually gave up all thought of writing except during the summer months. "I cannot write a book at home," he frankly told his mother. And Mrs. Clemens heroically did her part. She loved these things also in her own way. She took pride in them, and realized that they were a part of his vast success. Yet in her heart she often longed for the simpler life, above all for the farm life at Elmira. Her spirit cried out for the rest and comfort there. Could anything be more ironical? It was to satisfy her that he had repressed in himself the child of light in order to become the child of this world, and now she found herself actually drowning in the flood of that deflected energy. To shine, meanwhile, to make money, to rival and outrival those whom the public most admired, had become Mark Twain's ruling passion. With the beginning of his life in Buffalo he was already a man of large consequence and events, and I have suggested that in the process of adapting himself all the latent instincts of his heritage had risen up in him. Take, for instance, that mechanical ingenuity which is one of the outstanding traits of the pioneer mind. It would certainly have remained in abeyance if Mark Twain had followed his natural tendency and become absorbed in literature. Now, however, with his ever increasing need of money, it came to the fore and was by way of turning him into a professional inventor. At any rate, he invented, among other things, a waistcoat enabling the wearer to dispense with suspenders, a shirt requiring no studs, a perpetual calendar watch charm, a method of casting brass dies for stamping book covers and wall paper, and a postal check to supplant the money order in common use, not to mention the Mark Twain scrapbook, which he did not hesitate, so confused were his artistic and his commercial motives, to promote under his own name. He had, moreover, an unfailing interest in the mechanical devices of other people. When he installed a telharmonium in his house at Redding, he made a little speech telling his friends that he had been the first author in the world to use a typewriter for manuscript work. His impression was that Tom Sawyer was the first book to be copied in this way, but Mr. Paine thinks it was Life on the Mississippi; that he had been one of the earliest users of the fountain pen, and that his had been the first telephone ever used in a private house. To this we can add that he was one of the first to use the phonograph for dictation, and one of the first purchasers also of the high-wheeled bicycle. We can see one reason for this eager interest in mechanical inventions in the fact that out of it grew many of those adventures in financial speculation to which also, in true pioneer fashion, Mark Twain was drawn like steel to the magnet. He invested, and usually lost, large sums of money in the following patents: a steam generator, a steam pulley, a new method of marine telegraphy, a new engraving process, a new cash register, a spiral hat pin. His losses in almost every one of these enterprises amounted to between $25,000 and $30,000, and this is not to mention the Page typesetting machine, which cost him nearly $200,000 and whole years out of his life. He complained of the anxiety these ventures caused him, of the frantic efforts he had to make in order to collect the money to invest in them. But he had no choice now. He had to make money to keep the mill going at home, and he had to make money in order to make money. Besides, he was the victim of his own past, of the gambling habits of the gold fields. Within 1 month after the happy conclusion of those agonizing years of struggle to redress his bankruptcy, he was negotiating with an Austrian inventor for a machine that was to be used to control the carpet weaving industries of the world, planning a company to be capitalized at $1,500,000,000. Can we not see what an immense creative force must have been displaced in order to give passage to this desire, as Mr. Paine calls it, to heap up vast and sudden sums to revel in torrential golden showers? Mark Twain boiled over, we are told, with projects for the distribution of General Grant's book. His thoughts were far too busy with plans for furthering the sale of the great military memoir to follow literary ventures of his own. He had taken over the book because, as the most conspicuous publisher in the world, for this he had in fact become, he had an immense plant going, yawning, one might say, for the biggest available mouthful. His profit from this particular enterprise was $150,000. Huckleberry Finn brought him, at about the same time, $50,000 more. "I am frightened," he wrote, "at the proportions of my prosperity. It seems to me that whatever I touch turns to gold." His blood was up now, however. He was insatiable. How could he, who as a miner had known what it was to be a millionaire for 10 days, and who had become the servant of no conscious creative principle, resist the propulsion of a demoralized money sense? There, at least, that balked energy of his might express itself freely, gorgeously, to the applause of all America. We see him planning to make millions from a certain game of English kings, proposing a grand tour of authors. He and Howells, Aldrich, and Cable are to swing about the country in a private car, with himself as impresario and paymaster, reaping a golden harvest, calculating that the American business alone of the Page typesetting machine is going to yield 35 millions a year. What if he and his family are almost literally killing themselves with anxiety over that infernal invention, which cost them $3,000 a month for 3 years and 7 months? What if his life is broken by feverish business trips across the ocean, by swift and deadly forays against the publishing pirates of Canada? What if he is in the state of chronic agitation and irritation, excited, worried, impatient, rash, frenzied, and altogether upset? He is living against the grain. No matter, he is living the true American life, living it with a mad fervor. He cannot even publish a book in the ordinary way. He has to make a fortune out of every one. A book in the trade, he says, is a book thrown away, as far as money profit goes. Any other means of bringing out a book than subscription is privately printing it. He liked the game of business, Mr. Paine says, especially when it was pretentious and showily prosperous. Yes, there Tom Sawyer might swagger to his heart's content and have all the multitude and the enemies of his own household with him. "Here I am," he exclaims in the vision of the fortune that poet in steel, Page, is going to bring him. "Here I am, one of the wealthiest grandees in America, one of the Vanderbilt gang, in fact." Could Elmira have asked more of him than that? For Mark Twain was not simply living the bourgeois life now. He had adopted all the values and ideals of the bourgeoisie. Success, prestige, position, wealth had become his gods, and the tribal customs of a nation of traders identical in his mind with the laws of the universe. He was, after all, a literary man, yet as a publisher he was more oblivious to the advancement of literature than the ordinary man of the trade. His policy was the pursuit of big names, and that alone. What were the works issued or projected under his direction by the firm of Charles L. Webster and Company? The memoirs of General Grant, General Sheridan, General McClellan, General Hancock, and Henry Ward Beecher, the life of poet Leo XIII, and a book by the King of the Sandwich Islands. It was not even greatness outside of literature that he sought for, it was mere notoriety. One would say that in his lifelong passion for getting his name and fame associated with those of other men who were secure of the suffrages of the multitude, Mark Twain was almost consciously bidding for approval and corroboration. He had that slavish weakness of all commercialized men. He worshiped, regardless of his own shadowy convictions, any one who was able to "put it over." We know what he thought of Cecil Rhodes, yet "I admire him," he said. "I frankly confess it, and when his time comes I shall buy a piece of the rope for a keepsake." As for Mrs. Eddy, he finds her grasping, sordid, penurious, famishing for everything she sees, money, power, glory, vain, untruthful, jealous, despotic, arrogant, insolent, illiterate, shallow, immeasurably selfish. Yet still, in several ways the most interesting woman that ever lived, and the most extraordinary. It is quite within the probabilities," he goes on, regarding the founder of Christian Science, "that a century hence she will be the most imposing figure that has cast its shadow across the globe since the inauguration of our era." Why, pray? Because of her genius for organization, because of her success in "putting over" what he freely calls, in spite of his faith in its methods, the greatest hoax in history. And why did he admire modern Germany and despise modern France? The Frenchman, he said, is the "most ridiculous creature in the world." His only race prejudice was against the French. In this, and in his blind worship of imperial Germany, he reflected the view which the majority of American business men have conveniently forgotten of late years that they ever held. It was not the old Germany that he admired, never that. It was Wilhelm's Germany, Bismarck's Germany. He who, in the Connecticut Yankee, had set out to make medieval England a going concern, could hardly do other than adore the most splendid example of just that phenomenon in all history. Mark Twain had, in fact, taken on the whole character and point of view of the American magnate. How enormously preoccupied his later European letters are, for instance, with hotels, cabs, couriers, all the appurtenances of your true Western packing house prince on tour. We are told that once, by some tragic error, he installed himself and his family in a quarter of Berlin which was eminently not the place for a distinguished man of letters, and that he hastened to move to one of the best addresses in the city, of which there was no need to be ashamed. He had become, we see, something of a snob, a fact illustrated by a sorry episode in Mr. Paine's biography, which he remembered with a feeling of guilt and mortification. He had engaged a poor divinity student to go abroad with him and his family as an amanuensis, and he told how that young man had met them, in his bedraggled raiment, on the deck of the ship, just as they were about to sail. "He came straight to us and shook hands and compromised us. Everybody could see that we knew him." What supremely mattered to Mark Twain now was the pomp and circumstance of his own prestige. So touchy had he become that we find him employing an agent in England to look up the sources of a purely imaginary campaign of abuse he thought a certain New York newspaper was carrying on against him. He wrote, but did not mail, blasting letters to his assailants and those who crossed or criticized him. He indulged in ferocious dreams of libel suits, this man who had staked everything on his reputation. Was it not his glory that he was beset by all the cranks and beggars in Christendom? His pride was not in his work, it was in his power and his fame. Thus it came to pass in these middle years of his life that while in the Old World virtually every writer of eminence was inalterably set against the life-destroying tendencies of capitalistic industrialism, Mark Twain found himself the spokesman of the Philistine majority, the headlong enthusiast for what he called "the plainest and sturdiest and infinitely greatest and worthiest of all the centuries the world has seen." The second half of Life on the Mississippi glows with complacent satisfaction over the march of what he was pleased to accept as progress, the purely quantitative progress of an expanding materialism. It bristles with statistics. It resembles, in fact, nothing so much as the annual commercial supplement of a Western newspaper. In 1875, when he was on one of his many pinnacles of prosperity, he wrote a Utopia, the Curious Republic of Gondour. And what was the sort of improvement he showed there that he desired for the world? He suggested that for every 50,000 sacos a man added to his property, he was entitled to another vote. The fable was published anonymously. The great democratic humorist could hardly father in public the views of the framers of the American Constitution. But we can see from this how far Mark Twain, like the chameleon which he said man was, had taken the colors of the privileged class which the new industrial regime had brought forth and of which his own material success had made him a member. His essential instinct, as we know, was antagonistic to all this. His essential instinct, the instinct of the artist, placed him naturally in the opposition with all the great European writers of his age. Turn to his letters and see what he says in the privacy of his correspondence and memoranda. He is strongly against the tariff. He vehemently defends the principle of the strike and woman suffrage. He is consistently for the union of labor as against the union of capital. He bitterly regrets the formation of the trusts. A ruling public and political aristocracy which could create a presidential succession is, he says, neither more or less than monarchism. He deals one blow after another against the tendencies of American imperialism, against the balance of power, against the great power system. And hear what he writes in 1887: When I finished Carlyle's French Revolution in 1871 I was a Girondin. Every time I have read it since I have read it differently, and now I lay the book down once more and recognize that I am a sans-culotte, and not a pale, characterless sans-culotte, but a Marat. All this in the privacy of his correspondence. In public he could not question, he did not wish to question, the popular drift of his age, the popular cry of his age, "Nothing succeeds like success." Shall I be told that he created quite a scandal in Hartford by deserting the Republican party and becoming a mugwump? At least he was in very respectable company. In his impetuous defense of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the living, tearing, booming 19th, the mightiest of all the centuries, he was incessantly fighting his own instincts. We find him, in one situation after another, defending on the most factitious grounds, for trumped up reasons which he had to give his conscience, but which he would have laughed at if any one else had used them, vindicating, frantically vindicating, causes which he loathed in his heart, but which he was constrained to consider just. Is it the Boer War? It is abhorrent to him, and yet he insists that England's hand must be upheld. He rages in secret for the weaker. In public an infallible monitor keeps him on the winning side. All that year, we note, Clemens had been tossing on the London social side. He had to mind his P's and Q's in London drawing rooms. And consider his remarks on the annexation of the Sandwich Islands. We can give them, he says, leather-headed juries, the insanity law, and the Tweed ring. We can make that little bunch of sleepy islands the hottest corner on earth, and array it in the moral splendor of our high and holy civilization. Shall we, to men benighted, the lamp of life deny? Do you imagine that he is overtly opposed to the annexation? No, we have Mr. Paine's word for it that this was Mark Twain's peculiar fashion of urging the step. At this very time he was coining money out of his lectures on Hawaii. He could hardly have afforded to take the unpopular view that found expression in his letters. In Berlin our fanatical anti-monarchist compresses his angry views about rebellion against kings into a few secret lines hastily written in his hotel bedroom. Then, having been cleverly invited to dine at the Kaiser's right hand, he proceeds to tell the world in a loud voice how incomparable the German Empire is. He was keeping a court of his own, in Berlin, in Vienna, with generals and ambassadors dancing attendance on him. How could he have spoken out? Yet it was not hypocrisy, this perpetual double dealing, though we should certainly have thought it so if psychology had not made us familiar with the principle of the water tight compartment. Mark Twain was the chronic victim of a mode of life that placed him bodily and morally in one situation after another where, in order to survive, he had to violate the law of his own spirit. To him, in short, all success was a fatality, and just in the degree that his repressed self raged against it, his dominant self became its hierophant, its fugleman. He who wrote an article passionately advocating that the salaries of American ambassadors should be quadrupled, and that an official costume should be devised for them, showed how utterly he failed of any sense of the true function of the man of letters. He had become, quite without realizing it, the mouthpiece of the worldly interests of a primitive commercial society, with no ideal save that of material prestige and aggrandizement. As we have seen, personal and private loyalties have come to take precedence in Mark Twain's mind over all other loyalties. No ideal with him, no purpose, no belief, was to be weighed for a moment if the pursuit of it, or the promulgation of it, was likely to hurt the feelings of a friend. Quite early in his career he planned a book on England, and collected volumes of notes for it only to give over the scheme because he was afraid his criticism or his humor would offend those who had taken him into their hearts and homes. Imagine Emerson having been prevented by any such consideration from writing English Traits. I have pointed out how utterly Mark Twain had failed to rise to the conception of literature as a great impersonal social instrument, how immersed he was in the petty provincial values of a semi-rustic bourgeoisie, among whom the slightest expression of individuality was regarded as an attack on somebody's feelings or somebody's pocketbook. As time had gone on, therefore, and his circle of friends had come to include most of the main pillars of American society, it had become less and less possible for the tongue-tied artist in him to assert itself against the complacent pioneer. We know what his instinctive religious tendency was, yet he had a fatal way of entangling his loyalties with very dogmatic ministers of the gospel. We know what his instinctive economic and political tendencies were, yet the further he advanced in his business activities, and the more he failed in them, the more deeply he involved himself with all the old freebooters of capitalism. How, then, could he have developed and expressed any of these tendencies in his writings? He whose closest personal friend and counselor for more than 40 years, as Mr. Paine says, was the pastor of what he had once, in a moment of illumination, called the Church of the Holy Speculators in Hartford, who from the depths of his gratitude was to say of H. H. Rogers, when the latter rescued him in his bankruptcy, "I never had a friend before who put out a hand and tried to pull me ashore when he found me in deep water." This man had given too many hostages to the established order ever seriously to attack that order. His dominant self had no desire to attack it. His dominant self was part and parcel of it. Some one offered him, as a publisher, a book arraigning the Standard Oil Company. "I wanted to say," he wrote, "the only man I care for in the world, the only man I would give a damn for, the only man who is lavishing his sweat and blood to save me and mine from starvation, is a Standard Oil magnate. If you know me, you know whether I want the book or not." His obligations had gradually come to be innumerable. We find him urging Mr. Rogers to interest the Rockefellers and the other Standard Oil chiefs in Helen Keller, trying to inveigle Carnegie into his moribund publishing business as a partner, accepting from St. Andrew's triumphant democracy the suggestion for his own Connecticut Yankee, and from St. Andrew himself a constant supply of Scotch whisky, begging his affectionate old friend Uncle Joe Cannon to accomplish for him a certain piece of copyright legislation. How was Mark Twain to set himself up as a heretic, he who had involved himself over head and ears in the whole complex of popular commercial life, he who was himself one of the big fish in the golden torrent? Only once, in a little book published after his death, Mark Twain and the Happy Island, does one find his buried self showing its claws. It is there recorded that Mr. Rockefeller, Jr., having asked him to speak before his Sunday school class, Mark Twain suggested as his topic an exposition of Joseph's Egyptian policy. The invitation was not repeated. So we see Mark Twain, this playboy, the pioneer in letters, the strayed reveler, the leader of the herd, giving and taking with a hearty liberality, all inside the folk feeling of his time, holding the American nation in the hollow of his hand, the nation, or rather the epoch, whose motto he had coined in the phrase, "Tell the truth or trump, but get the trick." Never was a writer more perfectly at home with his public. He does not hesitate, in his speeches and asides, to pour out the most intimate details of his domestic life, knowing as he does that all America, all prosperous America, is just one good-humored family party. When he fails in business, checks pour in upon him from every corner of the country. It was known, says Mr. Paine, that Mark Twain had set out for the purpose of paying his debts, and no cause would make a deeper appeal to his countrymen than that, or, for that matter, to the world at large. At Hartford, we are told, the whole neighborhood was "like one great family with a community of interests, a unity of ideals," and gradually that circle, wholly speculators and all, had widened until Mark Twain had become everybody's neighbor. Have I noted enough of his traits to show that in his dominant character he had become the archetypical pioneer? Let me note them once more. An uncritical and uncalculating temper, a large, loose desire for an expansive and expensive all-round life, a habit of accepting from his surroundings the prevailing ideas and modes of action, a naive worship of success and prestige, an eager and inveterate interest in mechanical inventions and commercial speculation, an instinctive habit of subjugating all loyalties to personal and domestic loyalties. To this let us add, finally, the versatile career of the jack of all trades. "I have been through the California mill," he said, "with all its dips, spurs, and angles, variations and sinuosities. I have worked there at all the different trades and professions known to the catalogues." And once, as if to show that he had qualified for the popular role and had forestalled what Mr. Croly calls the distrust and aversion of the pioneer democracy for the man with a special vocation and high standards of achievement, he drew up a list of his occupations and found that he had been a printer, a pilot, a soldier, a miner in several kinds, a reporter, a lecturer, and a publisher; also "an author for 20 years and an ass for 55." It is only with all this in mind that we can grasp Mark Twain's instinctive conception of the literary career. He never thought of literature as an art, as the study and occupation of a lifetime. It was merely the line of activity which he followed more consistently than any other. Primarily he was the business man, exploiting his imagination for commercial profit, his objects being precisely those of any other business man: to provide for his family, to gain prestige, to make money because other people made money, and to make more money than other people made. We remember how in 1868 he had written to his brother Orion: "I am in for it now. I must go on chasing phantoms until I marry, then I am done with literature and all other bosh, that is, literature wherewith to please the general public. I shall write to please myself then." Similarly, in 1899, almost at the other end of the span of his active life, he wrote to Mr. Howells: "For several years I have been intending to stop writing for print as soon as I could afford it. At last I can afford it, and have put the pot boiler pen away." Those two utterances show us clearly that the artist in him was sufficiently awake at the beginning and at the end of his career to realize, in the one case, that he was not living the creative life, and in the other that he had not lived it, for certainly his marriage had not relieved him from the necessity of pleasing the general public. Between whiles the creative instinct of the artist had been so supplanted by the acquisitive instinct of the pioneer that he had no conscious sense of control over his life at all. He was not the artist. He was the journalist, the capitalist equally in the fields of business enterprise and of letters. "If Sam had got that pocket," we remember the saying of his old California comrade, "he would have remained a pocket miner to the end of his days." If indeed literature had not become for him the equivalent of a gold mine, the only gold mine available on many occasions, would he have continued to write as he did? We know that whenever, as sometimes happened, the repressed spirit of the artist in him raised its head and perceived, if we may say so, the full extent of its debacle, Mark Twain was filled with a despondent desire, a momentary purpose even, to stop writing altogether. "Mama and I," wrote his little daughter Susy, "have both been very much troubled of late because papa, since he had been publishing General Grant's books, has seemed to forget his own books and works entirely. And the other evening, as papa and I were promenading up and down the library, he told me that he didn't expect to write but one more book, and then he was ready to give up work altogether, die, or do anything." Certainly he would never have so neglected, abandoned, his own writing to further the literary fortunes of General Grant, a task that almost any one might have done quite as well, if in his own writing he had been experiencing the normal flow of the creative life. He had thrown himself so eagerly into the publishing business precisely because his creative instinct had been thwarted. We have just seen what he said to Mr. Howells: "For several years I have been intending to stop writing for print as soon as I could afford it." Of the Connecticut Yankee he writes elsewhere: "It's my swan song, my retirement from literature permanently." He always found a certain pleasure in writing, even when he was writing at his worst, and yet we can see that the artist in him would gladly have put a stop to this ironical career, if it had not had another aspect, a more practical aspect, that appealed to his dominant self. From the very beginning Mark Twain's home always meant more to him than his work, which is simply another way of saying that that gregarious pioneer, that comrade and emulator of politicians and magnates, who was Mrs. Clemens's husband, found ample reason to continue his literary life for the sake of the material rewards it brought him. How completely, in a word, Mark Twain had adopted the prevailing point of view of the industrial epoch! How completely in him, during those middle years, the poet was submerged in the pioneer! Much as he praised men of letters like Howells, His real admiration and respect went out to the strong, silent men of money, like H. H. Rogers. One recalls the hesitation with which he, "the Lincoln of our literature," as Mr. Howells calls him, presumed to offer compliments to General Grant on the literary quality of his memoirs. "I was as much surprised as Columbus's cook could have been to learn that Columbus wanted his opinion as to how Columbus was doing his navigating." There is decidedly more than a personal humility in that. There is all the pioneer's contempt for the word as against the deed, an ingrained contempt for the creative life as against the life of sagacious action. And this was deeply characteristic of Mark Twain. He was always for the Bacons as opposed to the Shakespeares. In his private memoranda he does not conceal a certain disdain for Jesus Christ in comparison with Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics, and the indignant passion of his defense of Harriet Shelley, to mention an allied instance, is hardly qualified by any regard for her husband. Finally, writer as he was, his enthusiasm for literature was as nothing beside his enthusiasm for machinery. He had fully accepted the illusion of his contemporaries that the progress of machinery was identical with the progress of humanity. Hear what he writes to his brother on one of the several occasions when the Paige typesetting machine seemed to be finished. Dear Orion, at 12:20 this afternoon a line of movable types was spaced and justified by machinery for the first time in the history of the world, and I was there to see. It was done automatically, instantly, perfectly. This is indeed the first line of movable types that ever was perfectly spaced and perfectly justified on this earth. All the witnesses made written record of the immense historical birth, and also set down the hour and the minute. Nobody had drank anything, and yet everybody seemed drunk. Well, dizzy, stupefied, stunned. All the other wonderful inventions of the human brain sink pretty nearly into commonplaces contrasted with this awful mechanical miracle. It is one ex printer writing to another. How wonderful that machine must have seemed to a man whose hands remembered the grubby labor of the old village type case. But then Mark Twain was 54 years old at this time, and those memories were very far away, too far away, as even his financial interest was too shallow, after all, to account for this emotion before one of the innumerable mechanical miracles of the 19th century, of respect, of reverence, of awe-struck wonder. How far, we ask ourselves, how far had not Mark Twain become in order to experience that emotion in the presence of a piece of machinery, something no longer himself, but the embodiment of the whole industrial epoch? It is enough to note how capable he was of the elevations of religion, and what it was that caused those elevations in him. It was not literature. Paige, the inventor of this machine, he called a poet, a most great and genuine poet, whose sublime creations are written in steel, which leaves little to be said about the poets who write in mere words. And, in fact, on the occasion of Walt Whitman's 70th birthday, Mark Twain expressed, in a way, his opinion of such people. He congratulated the poet for having lived in an age that had witnessed, among other benefactions, the amazing, infinitely varied, and innumerable products of coal tar. He neglected to congratulate the age for having produced Walt Whitman. Chapter 7